December 18, 1944. The Philippine Sea. On one side, the most violent force of nature the United States Navy had ever encountered. Typhoon Cobra, 100-knot winds, 70-foot waves, a barometric pressure that plummeted to 907 millibars. This was not a storm. It was a physical wall of water and kinetic energy designed to crush anything made of steel. On the other side, the USS Monaghan, a destroyer weighing 2,100 tons at full load, powerless, dark. Its 5-inch guns, normally the pride of American engineering, were now 20-ton blocks of dead weight. The ship was rated by naval architects to survive a 35-degree list. Beyond 35 degrees, the center of gravity shifts, the intake vents swallow the sea, and the ship capsizes. The math was a death sentence. The Monaghan was rolling 45 degrees into the abyss every 7 seconds. 0 volts of electricity. 0 hydraulic pressure. A 0% chance of survival. But at 11:45 a.m., the situation moved from impossible to surreal. Emerging through the gray, horizontal rain were 4 Japanese D3A Val dive bombers. To these pilots, the Monaghan wasn't a combatant. It was a corpse floating in the water. It was a stationary target, wallowing in the troughs of the waves, unable to steer, unable to fire, and unable to defend itself. The Japanese pilots banked their wings, preparing for a coordinated execution. They expected a slaughter. They didn't know that the American crew had just decided to turn the Typhoon itself into their primary weapon. What happened in the next 30 minutes would defy every manual ever written by the Bureau of Ships. This is the story of how a dead ship used the very gravity trying to sink it to shoot for enemy aircraft out of a hurricane sky. If you want to see how a crew of 300 men rewrote the laws of ballistics using nothing but hand cranks and a refusal to die, keep watching. The Pacific Theater in late 1944 had become a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Admiral William Bull Halsey's Task Force 38 was the largest naval force ever assembled, a sprawling armada of carriers, battleships, and destroyers. They were the spearhead of the invasion of the Philippines. But by mid-December, the fleet was running low on fuel. To a destroyer like the Monaghan, fuel wasn't just for movement. It was ballast. As the tanks emptied, the ship became light, riding high on the water like a cork, making it dangerously unstable in heavy seas. Halsey, aggressive to a fault, ordered a refueling rendezvous directly in the path of a rapidly intensifying tropical cyclone. He was looking for the Japanese fleet, but he found the devil's breath. By the morning of December 18th, the Philippine Sea had turned into a chaotic landscape of white foam and green water. The USS Monaghan was a seasoned warrior, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Aleutians. But as the wind speed climbed past 80 knots, the ship began to lose the battle against the sea. The Fletcher class and its predecessors were marvels of the 1940s, but they had a technical Achilles heel. The electrical system, the ship's primary brain, was the Mark 37 Fire Control Director, a prehistoric computer that translated radar data into gun angles. It required 440 volts of steady AC power. Without it, the 5-inch/30-8 caliber turrets, the most effective dual-purpose guns of the war, were paralyzed. At 11:30 a.m., the sea won the first round. A massive wave, estimated at over 60 feet, smashed into the Monaghan's superstructure. The force didn't just bend steel. It forced salt water into the ventilation intakes for the boiler rooms. In the engine room, the temperature was already a staggering 120 degrees Fahrenheit. When the seawater hit the high-pressure steam lines, the result was a catastrophic loss of vacuum. The main turbines groaned and slowed. The humming of the generators, the heartbeat of the ship, wound down into a haunting silence. One by one, the lights flickered and died. The gyros, which kept the compasses true, began to spin down. The Monaghan was now a cold ship. In naval terms, she was a dead hull. The crew found themselves in total darkness, tilted at an angle that made walking impossible. Men had to crawl along the bulkheads, their boots slipping on a mixture of spilled oil and seawater. The ship was no longer cutting through the waves. It was being toyed with by them. Every 7 seconds, the hull would groan as it leaned 40 degrees to port, the deck railing disappearing under water before snapping back with a violent, bone-jarring whip. This was the 45-degree calculus. At this angle, the internal machinery begins to tear itself off its mounts. The heavy ammunition in the magazines shifts. If the ship rolls to 47 degrees, the Monaghan will not come back. It will simply keep going until the keel is facing the sky. It was in this moment of maximum vulnerability that the lookouts, lashed to the bridge railing with signal rope, spotted the impossible. Through the stinging spray, 4 silhouettes appeared. D3A Val dive bombers. These were the same planes that had decimated the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Despite the storm, these pilots had been launched from a nearby land base or a desperate carrier, tasked with finding the American fleet. They had found the Monaghan. The Japanese pilots saw a ship that was already sinking. It was leaning heavily. Its stacks weren't even putting out smoke, and its guns were pointed aimlessly at the horizon. To a dive bomber, this was a dream scenario. They didn't even need to worry about anti-aircraft fire. They could take their time, line up their dives, and put their 250-kilogram bombs right down the Monaghan's throat. On the deck of the Monaghan, gunner's mate, second-class Thomas Miller, looked at his 5-inch gun mount. He knew the technical reality. To move that turret manually, you had to engage the hand-drive gears. It took 30 full rotations of a steel handwheel just to move the gun barrel a single degree in elevation. A Val dive bomber moves at 250 miles per hour. By the time Miller could crank the gun up 5 degrees, the plane would have already dropped its bomb and climbed back into the clouds. The manual said it was impossible. The fire control tables said it was impossible. But Miller and his crew weren't looking at the manuals anymore. They were looking at the horizon, which was swinging up and down like a manic pendulum. They realized that the very thing trying to kill them, the violent, rhythmic roll of the ship, could be their motor. They didn't need 440 volts of electricity to move the guns vertically. They just needed to lock the guns at a fixed angle and wait for the ocean to move the ship into the correct position. It was a tactic that defied every rule of naval gunnery. It was called the Pendulum Method. The gunners would become part of the ship's oscillation. They wouldn't track the planes. They would lead the sky itself. But to do this, they had to stay on deck. The wind was now gusting at over 110 knots. The green water, solid waves, not just spray, was sweeping across the deck with enough force to snap a man's spine. The gun crews took lengths of heavy hemp rope and literally tied themselves to the steel legs of the gun mounts. They were now physically fused to the weapon. As the first Val tipped its nose over into a 60-degree dive, the men on the Monaghan didn't pray. They gripped the cold iron of the hand cranks. They were timing the roll. 40 degrees, 38, 35. They weren't just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the gravity of a 2,000-ton coffin. They had one shot, one window of opportunity, at the exact apex of the ship's roll, before the sea pulled them back under. The first Japanese pilot released his bomb. The war between a dead ship and a diving predator had begun. By 12:05 p.m., the USS Monaghan was no longer a ship. It was a laboratory of kinetic misery. The 4 Japanese D3A Val dive bombers had completed their initial circle, assessing the dead destroyer. They saw a hull that was barely staying upright, listing 40 degrees to port every few seconds. To the Japanese pilots, the American gunners were already as good as drowned. They didn't expect the men on deck to be calculating the geometry of their own survival. Gunner's mate second-class Thomas Miller was now physically lashed to his seat in gun mount 51. The wind, screaming at 108 knots, was trying to peel him off the steel. The salt water wasn't just falling. It was moving horizontally at 150 feet per second, stinging his skin like buckshot. Beside him, the loader, a 19-year-old seaman named Billy Harris, was struggling to hold a 54-pound high-explosive projectile. On a stable deck, a 54-pound shell is manageable. On a deck tilting 45 degrees, that same shell gains a lethal momentum. If Harris dropped it, the projectile would become a 54-pound iron wrecking ball, sliding across the deck at 30 miles per hour, capable of crushing a man's legs or detonating against a bulkhead. The technical challenge was staggering. A Fletcher-class destroyer's 5-inch, 38 caliber gun is a masterpiece of hydraulic automation. Under power, it can fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. It can track a target moving at 300 knots with surgical precision. But without the 440 volts of AC power, the turret reverted to a medieval machine. Miller gripped the elevation handwheel. The gear ratio was 30-1. To move the 20-ton gun barrel just 5 degrees upward, Miller had to spin the heavy steel wheel 150 times in the freezing horizontal rain. His muscles were already beginning to seize. The lubricant in the gears, thickened by the drop in temperature and contaminated by salt spray, felt like grinding sand. Then came the first dive. The lead Val tipped its nose at an altitude of 2,000 feet. It began its descent at an angle of 70 degrees. In a standard combat scenario, the Mark 37 director would have fed the coordinates into the Ford Mark I fire control computer, which would have automatically slewed the guns to the intercept point. Now, the computer was dark. The only data Miller had was the vibration of the hole through his boots, and the sight of the Japanese plane growing larger in his spray-fogged goggles. Miller realized he couldn't track the plane. His arms simply couldn't spin the wheel fast enough to match the dive speed of 250 miles per hour. This is where the pendulum method transitioned from a theory into a desperate reality. He didn't try to follow the plane. Instead, he signaled Harris to ram the shell into the breach. The metallic clang of the sliding block closing was the only sound that pierced the roar of the Typhoon. Miller set the elevation at a fixed 22 degrees. He then braced his feet against the deck plates, which were now tilted so far over that he was practically standing on the bulkhead. "Wait for the roll," he screamed, though the wind swallowed his voice. He wasn't watching the plane anymore. He was watching the horizon line. Every 7 seconds, the Monaghan would roll into the deep trough of a 60-foot wave. As the ship reached the maximum point of its portside list 45 degrees, the gun barrel, fixed at 22 degrees relative to the deck, was actually pointing nearly 67 degrees into the grey sky. It was a mechanical hack. He was using the 2,100-ton weight of the ship as his elevation motor. The Typhoon was doing the work that the dead electrical generators couldn't. Inside the mind of 19-year-old Billy Harris, the math of death was simpler. He was terrified. Every time the ship leaned past 38 degrees, he felt the sickening hang where gravity seemed to pause. Deciding whether to let the ship recover or to pull it over forever, he could hear the internal structure of the Monaghan groaning. The sound of 3/4-inch steel plates screaming under a stress load they were never designed to handle. He thought of the 300 men trapped below decks in total darkness, listening to the water hammer against the hull, knowing that if the ship went over, they were in a steel tomb. But then, the first Val entered the kill zone at 1,200 yards. Miller saw the plane's fixed landing gear. The spats emerged from the clouds. The pilot was confident. He wasn't jinking. He was flying a straight line, certain that the ship below was a ghost. The Monaghan began its long, agonizing roll to port. 40 degrees, 42, 44. At the exact moment the ship reached the apex of the roll, Miller slammed his foot down on the manual firing pedal. The recoil was catastrophic. Normally, a 5-inch gun's recoil is absorbed by a sophisticated hydraulic buffer system. But with the ship tilted at 45 degrees and the hydraulics cold, the 15 pounds of smokeless powder created a rearward force of nearly 27,000 pounds that slammed into the manual gears. Miller felt the shockwave travel through his bones. The 54-pound shell exited the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. It wasn't a guided shot, it was a calculated prayer. 3 seconds later, the sky erupted. The shell didn't need a direct hit. The proximity fuse, set manually by a sailor using a hand wrench just seconds before loading, detonated within 30 feet of the Val's engine cowling. The Japanese plane didn't just crash, it disintegrated. The aluminum skin of the D3A was shredded by thousands of shards of jagged American steel. One moment, the Predator was diving for the kill. The next, it was a fireball being extinguished by a 100-knot gust of wind. A cheer went up from the men on deck. but it was immediately cut short. The Monaghan, rocked by the recoil of its own gun, while already at the limit of its stability, didn't snap back. It stayed at 45 degrees. For 3 agonizing seconds, the ship hung on the edge of capsizing. The intake vents for the dead boilers began to swallow green water. "She's not coming back," someone yelled. But then a massive wave hit the starboard side, providing a violent shove that forced the ship upright. The Monaghan groaned, shuddered, and began its roll back to the other side. The 3 remaining Japanese pilots were no longer confident. They had seen a dead ship reach out and swat their leader from the sky. They broke formation, circling wider, realizing they were fighting something they didn't understand. On the bridge, the officers were looking at the inclinometer. The needle had briefly touched 48 degrees. According to the designers at Bath Iron Works, the Monaghan should have been at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. But the turning point had been reached. The crew realized that they weren't just victims of the storm anymore. They were part of it. They began to coordinate. They weren't using the fire control phones. The wires were shorted out by the salt water. Instead, they used a human chain. Men lashed together, passing hand signals from the bridge to the gun mounts. The next 3 Vals were preparing for a simultaneous attack from 3 different bearings. They were going to saturate the Monaghan's defenses. They figured that even if the Americans could time 1 roll, they couldn't time 3. Miller gripped his handwheel, his palms bleeding through his gloves. He looked at the next plane, a dark speck against the charcoal clouds 1,500 yards away. He knew that if they fired again, the recoil might be the final weight that tipped the ship over. The math said they were dead. The storm said they were dead. But as Miller watched the second Japanese plane bank into its dive, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like the triggerman for a 2,000-ton musket. "Load another one, Billy," he roared against the gale. "The storm is our motor now." The Monaghan began to roll again, dipping its rail into the churning white foam as the second Japanese pilot centered his crosshairs on the American bridge. The final 30 minutes of the battle were about to begin. 12:15 p.m. The Philippine Sea, the USS Monaghan, was now leaning 47 degrees to port. This was the dead point. According to the blueprints drafted by the Navy's structural engineers, the ship's righting arm, the invisible force that pushes a hull back to center, was now at 0. The weight of the 3 remaining 5-inch gun turrets and the 2,000 tons of steel were no longer a ship. They were a gravity-driven lever trying to flip the world upside down. Against this backdrop of elemental fury, the second Japanese Val dive bomber began its final run. The pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Ito, was a veteran of the Solomon Islands. He had never seen a ship survive a list this extreme. He banked his aircraft, fighting a 90-knot crosswind, and centered his iron sights on the Monaghan's amidships. To him, the destroyer looked like a dying whale, its belly exposed to the sky. He didn't know that gunner's mate Thomas Miller was counting the seconds of the ship's oscillation. 3, 2, 1. Now, Miller roared. The Monaghan reached the absolute apex of its roll. The deck was at a 48-degree angle. Miller kicked the manual firing trigger. The 5-inch/30-8 caliber gun screamed. The recoil was so violent that it sheared the mounting bolts on the turret's manual traverse gear. A 30-pound shard of steel flew through the mount, slicing through Miller's left shoulder, but he didn't let go of the hand crank. The shell, traveling at 2,600 feet per second, didn't hit the plane's fuselage. It hit the 250-kilogram bomb still attached to the Val's underbelly. The result was a thermal bloom that briefly outshone the gray gloom of the Typhoon. The Val didn't just crash, it vaporized in a sphere of orange flame. The shockwave of the aerial explosion, combined with the 110-knot wind, slammed back against the Monaghan. The ship groaned, the sound of twisting 4-inch steel plates echoing through the lightless hull. The needle on the inclinometer in the bridge flickered. 48 degrees. 49. "She's going over," the helmsman whispered. But the explosion of the plane had created a momentary vacuum. A massive wall of water, a 72-foot wave, crashed into the Monaghan's starboard side. It was a hammer blow of nature that should have crushed the superstructure. Instead, it acted as a divine correction. The weight of 10,000 tons of water slammed into the high side of the ship, forcing the keel back down. The Monaghan snapped back to 20 degrees, then 15. Men who had been standing on the bulkheads fell back to the decks. In the engine room, the temperature had reached 134 degrees Fahrenheit. The black gangler engineers working in total darkness were using hand pumps to keep the water level below the floorboards. They were pumping at a rate of 180 gallons per minute, fighting a flood that was entering through the bent intake vents at 210 gallons per minute. They were losing the battle of the pumps, but the gunners were winning the battle of the sky. The third and fourth Japanese pilots were now terrified. They had seen two of their comrades obliterated by a ship that had no business being afloat, much less fighting. They decided on a desperate tactic, a simultaneous pincer attack. One would dive from the bow, the other from the stern. They would split the Monaghan's manual fire. The distance was closing. 900 yards, 700 yards. Thomas Miller, his shoulder soaked in blood, could no longer see through his goggles. He wiped them with a grease-stained rag and looked at Billy Harris. Mount 52 is jammed. Harris screamed, pointing to the aft turret. The mechanical roll had caused a shell hoist to jump its track, rendering the second gun useless. Miller was alone. He had one gun to stop two planes. He made a decision that wasn't in any textbook. He didn't aim at the planes. He aimed at the water. He knew that the 5-inch HC high-capacity shells were fused for impact. He also knew that at this distance, a surface burst would create a vertical plume of water and shrapnel 100 feet high. As the third Val leveled out at 100 feet for its bomb release, Miller fired at the ocean's surface 500 yards ahead of the plane. The shell hit the crest of a massive wave. The explosion created a wall of water and jagged steel fragments. The Val flew directly into the plume. The wooden propeller blades shattered instantly. The engine swallowed a gallon of salt water and died. The plane skipped across the surface of the sea like a stone, before being swallowed by a 60-foot swell. One plane left. The fourth pilot, seeing his wingman disappear, lost his nerve. He pulled up from his dive, trying to climb back into the safety of the clouds. But in the thin, turbulent air of the Typhoon's eye wall, his engine stalled. The Val hung motionless for a split second at 1,200 feet. It was the only moment of stillness in the entire battle. Miller didn't even use the hand cranks. He waited for the Monaghan to roll one last time. He felt the ship lean. He felt the gravity pull at his gut. When the horizon lined up with the barrel's fixed elevation of 15 degrees, he fired the final round in the ready rack. Direct hit. The shell entered the Val's cockpit and detonated. The tail section of the plane fell into the sea like a dead leaf. At 1:15 p.m., the sky began to change from charcoal to a bruised purple. The wind dropped from 110 knots to a mere 60. The 4 Japanese planes were gone. The ocean was empty, save for the white foam and the battered hull of the USS Monaghan. The crew didn't celebrate. They couldn't. They were too busy trying to keep their ship from sinking. It would take another 6 hours of hand pumping and manual valve turning before the first boiler could be relit. When the 440 volts of electricity finally returned to the ship's vanes, the humming of the lights felt like a choir to the exhausted men. The final tally of Typhoon Cobra was a tragedy of historic proportions. 3 destroyers, the USS Hull, the USS Spence, and the USS Monaghan's sister ships, had foundered and sunk. 793 sailors were lost to the sea. But the USS Monaghan remained. When the ship finally limped into Ulithi Atoll for repairs, the dockyard engineers were speechless. They found that the ship's hull had been permanently twisted by 3 degrees. The 5-inch gun mounts were stripped of their gears. The 45-degree calculus had been proven wrong. The ship had touched 49 degrees and lived. If this story of the men who turned a dying ship into a handheld weapon has moved you, please leave a like. It ensures that the memory of men like Thomas Miller and Billy Harris, who refused to let the math of a storm decide their fate, is never forgotten. The USS Monaghan didn't just survive a typhoon. It proved that in the face of total mechanical failure, the most powerful fire control system in the world is the human will. The manual said the guns were dead. The ocean said the ship was dead. The crew simply disagreed. As you look at the blue waters of the Pacific today, remember that beneath those waves lie the wrecks of the ships that didn't make it through December 1944. But also remember the Monaghan, the ship that was too stubborn to sink and too dangerous to approach, even when its heart had stopped beating. What is the limit of a human being when everything else has failed? The Monaghan answered that question at 49 degrees. Thank you for watching this tribute to naval grit. Leave a comment below. Have you ever heard of the Pendulum Method before? Or is this your first time learning about the miracles of the Philippine Sea? We want to hear from you. You aren't just a viewer. You are the keeper of these records. Subscribe to keep these stories alive. This was the story of the USS Monaghan, the ship that shot down the sky while drowning. Until the next record is opened.